Hello everyone, welcome to another edition of Envera at the Board. Today we're going to be talking about using a source test or the results of a source test on an annual emission report. Let's get started. So let's just start by asking the question, why would you want to use the results of a source test on your annual emission report? And so as we talked about in a previous edition of At the Board, a source test or the results of a source test is one of the most accurate ways to determine an emission factor. Remember, there's actually 4 ways to determine emission factor. You can look one up on a lookup table, you can do an engineering calculation, you can do a mass balance, or you can do a direct measurement. And from that video, we said that doing a direct measurement, while it will give you the most accurate results, it actually will end up costing you, quite a bit of money to do so. But you want to use a source test because it's one of the most accurate ways to determine an emission factor when calculating emissions from a piece of equipment on your annual emission report. Now, the reason why it's the most accurate is because it provides actual data from the equipment in question. A lot of times emission factors from lookup tables overestimate emissions because that emission factor was developed using a large data set, and depending on the data quality of the data set that was used to produce the emission factor, you could have very high amounts of variability or very low variability. But in general, using an emission factor using an emission factor that you got from looking it up on a database such as AP42 will tend to actually overestimate emissions from your piece of equipment. Now, as it relates to an annual emission report, overestimating an emission factor can have several negative and unintended consequences. And sometimes you don't even know that this will happen just because you're not aware of the downstream sort of events that will result once you submit an annual emission report. But number one, you'll be subjected to increased fees. And the reason is because when you use an emission factor or a default emission factor, like we said before, these emission factors tend to overestimate emissions from your process. And so as it relates to an annual emission report, if you overestimate emissions on your annual emission report, you will actually then pay higher fees on your report when it comes time to submit that report. And so increased fees are one of the negative consequences that you can have by overestimating emissions. The second one is you could be subject to the AQMD's Title V and or reclaim rules, which will then cause your facility to become subject to a whole array of different rules and regulations that will almost always increase the amount of monitoring, reporting, and record keeping needed by your facility. And being subject to those regulations is simply based on emissions, and more specifically emissions reported on your AER. So the second consequence is you could be subject to a Title V or reclaim program. The third is you could exceed your emission limits on your permit without you even knowing, and then that could lead to a whole slew of compliance issues. And so, all of these issues you want to avoid as much as possible, and simply using an emission factor or simply using data that will overestimate emissions from your process can lead or will almost always lead to one of these outcomes. Now, don't get me wrong, there are benefits to using a source test. And we'll talk about some of those benefits at the end. They're actually over here. But yes, there are benefits to using a source test, which sort of leads up to the answer to this question. Can you use the results of a source test to calculate emissions on your annual emission report? And the short answer is yes, you can use the results of a source test on your annual emission report, but the source test needs to be approved before use. And so to do that, you must go through the source test approval process. To get the source test approved, you need to start with an approved protocol. And so the first step would be is to prepare and submit a source test protocol to the AQMD. Now, when you do that, you will typically be seeking for an approval. And if that approval is given to you, then the next step in the process is, upon approval, notify the AQMD within 14 days before the test. Once you provide this notification to the AER district, then you can go ahead and conduct the test as outlined in the protocol. And so the third step is important because you want to conduct the test with no deviations from what you told the AER district that you were going to do in the first step or within your protocol. So again, the third step is to conduct the test as outlined in the protocol. The fourth step would be to submit the results from the source test to the AQMD within 45 days of completing the test. Following that, you will want to wait for an approval letter from the AQMD notifying you or documenting that, yes, we have reviewed this source test and it is approved by us. Only when you receive that notification can you then use the results of that source test on your annual emission report. Now, if you don't, if you go through this process and you don't hear back from the district, then you want to go ahead and follow up as much as possible. And your first point of contact should always be your permit engineer. So again, to get a source test approved, you have to go through the process where you submit a protocol. Number two is, upon approval, you notify the AER district 14 days in advance of the test. Number three is that you conduct the test as outlined in the protocol. And number four, you submit the results of that test to the AER district for approval, and then you wait for the letter. Now, during all of these processes, you want to go ahead and maintain all of the documentation for this approval process. Maintaining everything in writing and maintaining all your notes is critical when dealing with the AER district and trying to prove that, yes, you are going through this process. You want to just make sure that your file is complete. Now, let's talk about some of the benefits. We talked earlier that there are benefits to using the source test on your annual emission report. So let's talk about some of these benefits here. First and foremost, when you use a source test on your annual emission report, you're actually able to reduce the emissions from that piece of equipment that you'll report on your AER. And like we've been mentioning, and we've said it many times before on previous At the Board videos, using a default emission factor will almost always overestimate emissions from your piece of equipment. So when you go ahead and use a source test, you're actually able to lower the emissions from your equipment. When you lower the emissions from your equipment on your AER, then you're able to calculate, or less fees are due by your facility to the AQMD on your AER because your emission levels have gone down because of using a more accurate emission factor, which was determined by a source test. And so there can be, a monetary value. It can affect the bottom line because you'll pay less fees. And then overall, you'll have a more accurate report. In this day and age, because a lot of records out there that you submit to the AER district, it becomes part of the public domain. A lot of the compliance reports or everything that you submit to the AER district, you want those documents and reports to be as accurate as possible so that no one can come back and say, well, you're emitting so much, air emissions during this certain year, and then they may come back and take action against you or file a citizen suit or something. And so you want your reports to be as accurate as possible. And the best way to do that is through using a source test on your annual emission report. Now, before closing out, we have a few miscellaneous items. Once you receive the approval letter from the AQMD, what you want to do is you want to go ahead and upload that approval letter to the AER reporting tool when preparing your annual emission report. And that way, the folks in the AER department will have this approval letter on hand when reviewing your AER. And so the results of the source test and the approval letter is filed along with your annual emission report, and that just keeps the file clean. And so you want to go ahead and upload the approval letter. Now, you know, a lot of the questions that we get is, okay, this is fine and well here. Like, we know that, yes, we want to do this. We want to, you know, get a source test approved so we can lower our emissions, pay less fees, and have a more accurate report. But how do we start the process? You know, where do we go? The AQMD is such a large agency. Where do we go? Who do we ask first to start the process? Now, the best answer to that is, with anything related to the AQMD, you should be really reaching out to your permit engineer as the first sort of level or first mode of communication or initial contact. And so in this case, again, you want to reach out to your permit engineer to start the process. You know, you can call them up on the phone, you can send them an email, you know, you can simply say, hey, look, we want to get a source test approved because we want to calculate more accurate emissions on our AER. How can you help us? You know, and then, you know, from there, they'll probably run you through this process. But as a first means, you want to reach out to your permit engineer. Your permit engineer will work with someone from the source testing group to get all of this set up. And so, you know, to really start the process, you want to reach out to your permit engineer. So there you have it. You know, the answer to this question here, can you use the result of a source test to calculate emissions on your annual emission report? And the answer is yes. And if you have the data, you should use it, granted that it's approved. And if you don't have the data, but it can be easily, or you can go out there and measure the data, or you can obtain the data, then be sure that the process, you go to the proper process to get the test approved so you can use the test when calculating emissions on your annual emission report. So there you have it, another episode of At the Board. We'll hope to see you in the next video. Take care.